On the left here, you have a graphic that charts together the price of West Texas Intermediate. This is the standard benchmark, as many of you will know, in the United States marketplace. WTI prices are mapped against the right-hand scale, whereas the number of rigs involved in that are directed after liquids, not gas, is shown on the left. And you can see very clearly this dramatic drop-off that took place in the period between 2014 and late 2015, early 2016, when one had lots of, I said 16, I meant 16 into 17, when one had lots of oil available in the marketplace, stocks globally well above 5-year averages, and the necessity in the shale plays continuously to do new drilling almost on an industrial kind of scale and tempo. So as soon as the oil price dropped, shortly thereafter, a concurrent drop in the rig counts. But by the same token, as with the rebound in oil prices, a return to drilling visible to the right side of the, let me see if I can actually do this. Oh, well, to the right side of the graphic. On the right-hand side of the slide, you see a number of different possible trajectories, projections benchmarked against different global oil prices. There's a great deal of uncertainty about how much rebound one will see in the period ahead, but an expectation that a rise in oil prices such as one has seen since the beginning of this year will continue to express itself in a return in the rig counts in the U.S. shale plays. Another feature that has been on the horizon in the United States in our energy discussions and also elsewhere around the globe has been a very unfamiliar discussion to many of us, and that is the idea of so-called peak demand. Now, about 10 to 15 years ago, there was a cottage industry, as we say, a very active discussion among analysts as to whether one was encountering so-called peak oil, peak supplies of oil. That discussion never took account adequately, I would say, of the ability of technology and market forces such as the very great incentive of prices in excess of $100 per barrel to incent new technologies and practices to come into the marketplace. So if peak oil on the supply side was a concept that didn't have a place, what about peak demand? The World Energy Outlook from the International Energy Agency in Paris, in its most recent edition, suggests that by 2040 one could see a reduction in some elements of global oil demand, including a notable but modest reduction in passenger vehicles around the globe. But as you'll notice on the right-hand side of this graphic, IEA projects a concurrent growth of larger scale up to about 4.5 million barrels a day of new demand, for example, in petrochemicals. Now, many of the U.S. oil companies, and indeed some from elsewhere around the globe, are posing questions to themselves about when peak demand could occur. Is it something that is a reality at all, perhaps being driven by efforts to control greenhouse gas emissions in the global economy? Or is this another mirage, the same as was true for the notion of peak supply? If I turn from oil to natural gas, I suspect that the basic elements of the shale gas story will be very familiar to this audience. In the United States, we have gone to the unusual position of being the globe's #1 natural gas producer. Certainly something that I did not expect. If you would have asked me this question 10 years ago or 15, it's not at all where one expected to go. This has been driven, as I say, by the development of unconventional extraction techniques, and it has the potential to have an impact globally on natural gas markets. So this graphic here shows the capacity for liquefaction, that is the creation of liquefied natural gas around the globe, reaching out to 2025. And the dark curve there is the demand curve. Now, there's a very, very active discussion that is going on among natural gas analysts globally, including my colleague Tim Bursma at the Center on Global Energy Policy and your own host, Dr. Tatiana Mitrova, about whether there exists today a glut of supply of LNG, and if it exists, how long its duration will be. And the views here are widely varied, from there's no glut even today, that in fact growth in LNG is triggering in turn greater demand for, because the price points are just moving into a place that are more comfortable for consumers. What you can take away from this, however, is that particularly with Australian and US growth in LNG exports, that if all other things remain equal in the marketplace, little secret, they almost never do, if everything else remains the same, that one could see a very significant growth in liquefaction capacity globally. Now, let me pause for a second on that if clause, if everything remains the same. One has seen in the case of Qatar in recent weeks new uncertainties about the ability of the world's largest shipper of LNG to continue in the fashion that it has been producing over the years. So one is never in a position where one can say with any certainty that the market will remain as it looks today. But nonetheless, if it did substantially, then the next phase that we go into is one of a great deal more competition to place cargoes in the global market. And indeed, as BP has highlighted in their, I'm sorry, this is not BP, this is IEA, I misspoke. As IEA has highlighted in the WEO, the World Energy Outlook that was issued last fall, the expectation is that the patterns of trade in LNG, A, will be much larger in scale, B, will be much more complex in the period between now and 2040, the end of their projection period. This graphic helps to understand the scale of the growth in LNG trade as opposed to pipeline trade in natural gas over the period ahead. Obviously, that more than doubling of total traded gas and the new role of dominance that is shown by LNG in the global market could be very significant in altering the terms of trade as well. As you will know, to date, there have traditionally been 3 regional markets for natural gas globally, one in Europe, one in North America, and one in East Asia. There is, in this growth in scale of LNG, the potential that you could essentially have a unified marketplace where the differential cost of transportation is the only differentiating factor in the market. The United States has emerged for the first time as a major, as an LNG exporter. In the last year, less, the first of the LNG export facilities in the United States, namely the one at Sabine Pass that is operated by the company called Cheniere, has been commissioned and entered into operation. And to date, it has they have exported from Sabine Pass more than 100 cargoes going to different destinations around the globe. They're shown here on this slide in front of you. Now, it may be surprising to see how dominant in the overall destinations have been destinations in the Western Hemisphere, in Mexico and in South America, and a little bit in the Caribbean. I think there are very few people in the United States who would have expected that outcome after the first period of operation of Sabine Pass. But the point that it makes, I think, is pretty important, which is, in an increasingly global marketplace, where the gas goes will be determined by what the economic opportunity is at the moment. So there's been lots of talk about the idea of US gas to Europe. That might happen, it might not. I presume that Qatar will continue to be a very important, in fact today the largest LNG exporter. I presume that Australia also will be a major exporter. So in the end, the market opportunities will determine where gas cargoes get placed and when. One of the most interesting features of what has been unfolding in the United States in oil and in gas over the last couple of years has been the increasing productivity of wells drilled targeting gas and targeting oil. So on the left-hand side here, you see a number of the light, tight oil plays and the barrels per day that are coming out of the average well drilled in a variety of the different specific plays across the United States. So you will see this steady rise over the last couple of years as learning and technological learning has been underway in the industry. Now, there's a live question as to whether, and if so, how much, these apparent increases in the drilling productivity have been real or have been the effect of other issues. For example, since the downturn in price in 2014, a lot of the US light tight oil producers have curtailed production or have slowed down their tempo of further drilling. And they have concentrated naturally on the most productive individual plays. They've concentrated most particularly also on the most productive rigs and rig crews, the personnel. And so it's quite possible, as you'll see, for example, if you look at, and I'm sorry I speak as a colorblind person, but the Permian Basin, which is roughly in the middle of the left-hand graphic, you can see a slight downturn in the productivity there. And the presumption that analysts are expressing now is that that reduction in productivity represents a rise in costs and a relatively lesser attractiveness of the particular parts of the basin that are being drilled into. So a natural question that would arise is whether the improvements in the efficiency, the productivity of the drilling is a real phenomenon, or was it something that was only associated with that high grading, if you will, of the particular plays and personnel and rigs. the Energy Information Administration, which is the statistical and analytical piece of the U.S. Department of Energy, to the best of their experts' ability, they suspect that there's been some effect of masking, giving the appearance of growth in productivity where it may have been the result of this high grading and selective development, but that overall, if you look back in particular to the 2012 period, you see this growth in productivity both on the oil and on the natural gas side. So those are a few comments about where we have been going through the last decade in the United States, and then along comes the gentleman on the left-hand side of this graphic, Mr. Trump. And I'd like to spend the next couple of minutes talking a little bit about the things that he has expressed as the intentions of his administration's policy, and some of the features of that policy that may or may not come to pass. Now, I suspect that if you've heard anything about Mr. Trump's policies, you will have heard the expression America First, which is the particular way in which our new president seeks to explain to the American public what his overall objectives are in the United States. And as part of his political approach, such as it is, Mr. Trump has expressed the objective of an America First energy policy, which in broad strokes, and I would say that it exists only in broad strokes, if you can look on the White House website if you are obsessive or curious or something like that. It speaks about reductions in cost for consumers. Okay, that is an understandable and laudable goal. It talks about deregulation, removal of burdensome regulations as it is expressed, revival of the U.S. coal industry, which is something I'll talk about in a moment, and use of domestic U.S. resources, especially shale oil and, tight oil and shale gas. Mr. Trump also talked about, and on June 1st he announced his formal intention to remove the United States from the Paris Climate Agreement. And he has also talked about a number of objectives that he hopes will result in American energy independence, as he says, or even worse, in my opinion, American energy dominance. But I think one point to take from that listing of objectives that the new president has enunciated is that many of these are easier to express in a pithy form that is suitable for use of Twitter, and many of those ideas are in fact a whole lot more difficult to implement and might not even be a good idea in the first place. For example, the dismantling of Obama-era climate policies and structures is something that is obviously of very high importance to President Trump. The so-called Clean Power Plan, which was a measure that was set in place by the Obama administration and that called on our states to develop individual implementation plans by which the greenhouse gas emissions from existing or new power plants would be administratively controlled. That objective is one of the things that Mr. Trump has indicated that he wishes to end and to remove. There is, however, in U.S. practice, a requirement that regulatory features that are instituted as part of our laws and policies must be justified first by a rigorous analysis of benefits and costs. And that analysis must be documented in publicly available information that provides the logical justification for taking the regulatory step that is put in place. It is equally true that to remove a regulatory position, one must again go through an analysis of benefits and costs of the regulation. So it's very easy, and indeed the new president has many times declared his intention to remove the Clean Power Plan from existence, but doing that will require a great deal of homework, public consultation, and decision-making that must be justified to the public. Abandoning the Paris Climate Agreement was, as I said, an announcement that the President made on the 1st of June. In that instance as well, things will not be quite as quick to unfold as the President, I think, would have liked. The Paris Agreement includes very specific provisions about the circumstances under which countries that have accepted or ratified the Paris Agreement may subsequently remove themselves from participation in Paris. The different elements of those procedures translate into a reality on the calendar that the soonest possible moment by which the United States could actually remove itself from the Paris Agreement happens to be the day after our next presidential election. This doesn't mean that President Trump won't succeed in that objective of removing the United States from Paris. He could be our next president if he is reelected. But this is to underscore again another instance where these objectives are easier to express than to carry out. Let me skip down this slide a couple of points to the item called Renewable Investment and Production Tax Credits. For the last couple of decades, there has been, as a part of our energy investment landscape, a tax credit that is provided for the developers and operators of solar and wind power projects in the United States. Now, these tax credits were created in the first place out of the belief that there was an inherent benefit in having at the disposal of our economy energy sources that were not dependent on fuel costs. And one of the defining features of solar and wind development, of course, is that the cost, the lion's share of the cost, comes up front in the form of capital expenditure. Yes, there are operating costs, but by comparison to the variable costs of running a power plant and buying fuel for it, it's a much, much different picture. So the investment tax credit, which is available to those that put up the investment for a project, the production tax credit for the operators, were put in place and are now scheduled to be phased out in the next several years. Why? Because costs for those technologies have dropped rapidly. The President indicated his intention to try to remove, even in advance of that phase out, the ITC and the PTC, the production and investment tax credits. The response, however, from a member of his own party who sits as the chair of the Senate Finance Committee, namely that committee in our Senate that would have to approve a measure to change the tax credits, he indicated in very direct terms I will paraphrase. He said, I believe, nearly the following, and this is not exact, but understand it's quite close. "Over my dead body will that happen," said Chairman Grassley. Chairman Grassley comes from the state of Iowa, and you'll see more about the state of Iowa here in a second. I'd be happy to talk about other examples in this list, but I'll move on now for sake of time. The question is, what then will be the impact if, for example, the president is able to remove the Clean Power Plan? This has been the subject of extremely lively debate in the United States. The Clean Power Plan, again, to remind you, is that regulatory approach that was put in place by the Obama administration as a distinctly second best approach to find a way to cause a reduction in electricity sector greenhouse gas emissions. On the left-hand side of this slide, there is a breakdown with projections for 2020, 30, and 40 of what the fuel mix would be in the United States without the Clean Power Plan, no Clean Power Plan. On the right-hand side, the same thing for the same benchmark dates with the Clean Power Plan being implemented beginning in the 2020s. Now, as you will see, if you look, for example, at the 2040 column, the scenario in which the Clean Power Plan is not in place involves significantly more coal. It involves significantly less natural gas and renewables sourcing. Now, the interesting feature of this, one of the interesting features, is that between now and 2020, there will be no discernible impact except if utility operators make a voluntary choice to get ahead of the game. Would they do so? Well, in the last couple of weeks, the Edison Electric Institute, which is the association of all of the so-called investor-owned utilities in the United States, had their annual meeting. And as a part of that meeting, they had an engagement with the head of the Environmental Protection Agency, Mr. Pruitt, his name is. And all of the reports coming out of that meeting with Mr. Pruitt being one of the most staunch advocates for removal of the Clean Power Plan, all the reports indicate that the companies, the utility companies that are operating power plants across the United States said, point one, we're getting out of coal. Why? Because there are more competitive options in the marketplace, and because we would benefit from having clarity and predictability in the marketplace, we'd be perfectly happy to have the Clean Power Plan in place. I mentioned earlier that one of the president's objectives is the return of the U.S. coal industry, which has been on very hard times in the last decade, as you will understand. My colleagues at the Center on Global Energy Policy, together with an analytical group called Rhodium, did an analysis of whether it is reasonably foreseeable to anticipate the return of the U.S. coal industry. Short answer, not so much. The right end of this graphic, you can see a range of possible scenarios for what the coal industry might amount to in terms of tons of coal produced, some of which would be for export, other of which would be for consumption in the United States. The Obama policies, including the Clean Power Plan that I've discussed earlier, would have created a downward trajectory there. The executive order that Mr. Trump has been developing would basically stabilize. Now, the reason for the range is that there are assumptions that are built in here about the comparative cost of coal as opposed to natural gas as opposed to renewables. And so you can theoretically construct a scenario under which you end up with high natural gas costs, relatively higher renewables, and therefore a firmer price for coal. But the analysis, both from my colleagues at the center and also from the US industry, don't see a very rosy picture ahead for coal in any event. In the political system of the US, we refer frequently to Democratic-leaning states as blue states, Republicans as red states. One of the most interesting features that has been unfolding in recent years has been the uptake, the application of solar and wind across the United States in different markets. And as you will see here, particularly if you look on the left-hand side, where one is talking about wind capacity, the states with the biggest deployment of wind out of the top 5 include 4 Republican-led states. On the solar side, 2 out of the top 4 are Republican. And I put this graphic in front of you for the purpose of highlighting that not as a matter of ideology, but as a matter of economics, the states across the United States are making decisions that will have major impacts for what our energy policy and our climate policies look like going forward. 30 of our states across the United States have so-called renewable portfolio standards. These are standards that determine administratively and in law what should be the minimum percentage of the total fuel mix that is coming from renewable sources. From an economic perspective, you couldn't claim that this is the most efficient way of reaching that diversified fuel mix. And it must be noted, in fairness, that one of the effects of these renewable portfolio standards is to create a support for wind and solar, which might not be there in quite the same extent in the absence of those standards. Nonetheless, as a matter of determination by the individual states, it's a quite powerful and frequent tool. So let me stop there. In short, I would highlight that it is a time when there is a great deal of change afoot and uncertainty, in fact, in the US energy sector. It would be a mistake, I would say, to assume that everything that has been said about energy policy going forward under the new administration will occur in reality exactly as it has been declared. And maybe that's a good thing, or maybe that's a bad thing. So I'll stop there.
Thank you so much. Ну что ж, друзья мои, я надеюсь, вы заготовили свои вопросы. У нас микрофоны. Поднимайте, пожалуйста, руки, представляйтесь, кто вы, и задавайте свой вопрос. Jonathan, do you need translation?
I don't think so. If you will be kind to me and speak a little bit slowly, then I think I'll catch the questions. So, and I may sit down to write.
So, I'm looking for the raised hands. No?
Okay, while you are heating up, I'll ask my own question. So, there is anything that Mr. Trump can change during his presidency that would have a great impact on the energy sphere, or everything has to be counterbalanced by the other players?
Thank you for the question. Look, there absolutely are things that Mr. Trump can do and fully intends to do. In our system, there is a structural equality between the power of the executive and the legislative branch. Now, the legislative branch, our Congress, today is controlled by the same party as Mr. Trump in both elements, both houses of the Congress. And so there is a considerable possibility that Congress will work very much in partnership with the president on matters where they see eye to eye. So I certainly don't wish to be understood as saying that there will be no changes. There will be changes. My only point was those changes will not come in quite the simplicity and the speed that I think that the president and some in his administration would hope for.
Thank you.
Okay, any other questions, or I will raise my question? Oh, you have. Zlata, быстрее.
Please raise your hands in advance in order that I could come.
If you don't mind, I will ask in Russian. Yeah? В настоящее время в Конгрессе США рассматривается законопроект, который, в частности, увеличивает...
Я вообще не могу слышать.
If you don't mind, I will ask a question in Russian. В настоящее время в законодательных органах власти Соединенных Штатов Америки в Конгрессе рассматривается законопроект...
Медленнее, пожалуйста, будьте любезны.
В настоящее время рассматривается законопроект по санкциям в отношении России и, в частности, в отношении энергетического сектора России. В частности, в связи с вашей презентацией, там рассматривается вопрос о магистральных трубопроводах нефти и газа. Вот в этой связи, как вы считаете, является ли это еще не только политической подоплекой, но и инструментом...
Что?
Если там не только политическая подоплека, но и инструмент конкурентной борьбы, потому что мы говорим, что сейчас значит, рынок, например, сжиженного газа, сжиженного топлива увеличивается, а рынок, значит, ну, скажем, доставки топлива по трубопроводу существенно сжимается. И не является ли это как бы, ну, скрытой, так сказать, конкурентной поддержкой ну, рынка сжиженного газа?
Whether it's competitive.
Are Americans trying to promote their LNG
right.
through these sanctions?
Right,
So
right.
is it part of the
Right,
competition?
right, fine. Sorry, it was very difficult for me to hear and then for my brain to work and understand. So, let me start with just the question of sanctions. I believe that there is a very high probability that new sanctions will be put in place by the US Congress. I say this as somebody who is not a great supporter at all of economic sanctions to begin with. But in my best attempt to understand what I see as the likelihood, I think that there is a high probability that there will be new sanctions that will be put in place by the US Congress. It is important to understand that right now in the United States, there is a great deal of concern about repeated reports of intrusion by parties from Russia in the US electoral process. Again, I don't mean to, I'm not an advocate of this, but I am simply stating that fact because there are very few things that are more central to the United States political system than the idea that we, Americans, get to decide our leadership. Sometimes we do so in a highly imperfect way. And speaking as a Democrat, I can tell you it will not be a surprise that I was not especially pleased at all by the results of our last election. But this issue of intrusion in our election system, if the reports are accurate, is really a very big deal to most Americans at the end of the day. Now, I can also tell you that those sanctions, I think, are have the risk of becoming kind of a permanent feature, or at least an indefinite feature, in our US-Russian relationship. That is also something that I would not wish for. So I hope that policymakers from the US side and policymakers on the Russian side can sit down, can find a constructive way to discuss matters on which they disagree about all different parts of the world, and instead can put us onto the footing of a better interaction between the United States and Russia. So, and I'm sorry, to the element of your question about support for US natural gas exports. I would bet that there are some people in the US political system who would be very happy if the effect of sanctions is what you suggest. However, having said that, I believe that most Americans, including most members of the US Congress, feel that there is a greater importance in the market making decisions about where US natural gas or anybody else's natural gas should go. Please.
If I'm allowed, I would like to ask you 2 questions.
Sorry?
If I'm allowed, I would like to ask you 2 questions. Is it okay?
Please.
Yes. The first question is, recently the sanctioning of, not sanctioning of, how do you say, approval of US LNG project, speed of US LNG projects approvals of FERC, is
Of what?
speed of US LNG project approval is getting faster, and there are more and more LNG export projects are being approved by Department of Energy and FERC, or FERC, yes.
Yes.
And I believe that this may affect, if the large volumes of US LNG projects are approved, that it may affect domestic natural gas price in the United States, and it may lead to loss of price competitiveness of US LNG in the global market. For example, like what happened in Australia, they have approved a lot of LNG projects, and they have a problem of a shortage of natural gas in domestic market. And
so let me address this. The question was in regard to the tempo of approvals of new export projects from the United States. I don't wish to belabor the point, but there are 2 types of approvals that are required if one is to export LNG from the United States. One is for the amount of the commodity to be exported, and then a second approval is specific to the installation, the facility. The first comes from the Department of Energy, the second from our Federal Energy Regulatory Commission, or FERC. Now, before the decision to start giving approvals for the export of natural gas, the Department of Energy was required to go through an assessment of whether those exports are consistent with the national interest of the United States. That terminology, consistent with the national interest, is written into our Natural Gas Act. It's a piece of legislation that was actually passed in the 1930s, so long before anybody thought about LNG tankers. And for any country with which we do not have a free trade agreement, that export needs to be deemed to be consistent with the national interest. Already, nearly 200 billion cubic meters per year of exports have been approved. They are not all happening today because in many cases, the export facilities, the liquefaction facilities, either don't exist at all or are still under construction. And it is reasonable to expect that not all of those export facilities that have been proposed will in fact happen, because the market, sooner or later, will decide there's probably not enough demand, or maybe there is, et cetera. That'll happen over time. So yes, there has been a long discussion in energy circles in the United States over the last 3 to 5 years about whether the approvals occur fast enough, whether there are enough of them. Mr. Trump has indicated that he wishes to have the approval process move more quickly. That's fine. However, even today, many, I would say most, American analysts of this question don't believe that all of the liquefaction capacity will be built in order to provide 200 BCM per year to the global market. Please.
The next question is mine. First of all, thank you for such a great lecture and a lot of information. My question will be a little bit long. So if to come back to Paris Agreement, while all countries today try to reduce CO2 emissions and try to reach some share of renewables in the whole economy, USA declared leaving of Paris Agreement. What do you think it may lead to reach so-called energy independence of US, but to make a back step and to use again coal and reach the share of coal in energy balance? Or it is some kind of strategic decision of Trump administration, maybe, it's up to my mind and to my opinion, to force some strategic projects. Again, it may be related to LNG projects and so on. And so what do you see the options? Is just energy independence, or it's something more very strategical in this decision? Thank you.
Thank you for the question. Look, this is a question that is on the minds of many people in the United States and outside as well. So let me try to take different elements of that question. First of all, on the idea of energy independence. I don't think that exists. To be a little bit less dogmatic about it, but a little bit more analytical. In the United States, if you look at the refined gasoline, gasoline and now in the last couple of years, year and a half, also crude oil, can be freely exported from the United States without prior approvals or anything. If you want to export it, Bogoradi, on you go, right? If all of a sudden the United States produced all of its crude oil and refined product inside of our borders, and the price went up globally, the price in the United States would exactly track that. Why? Because if you're a producer, you have the opportunity to export that product onto the global market. Even if you look only at the idea of ethanol-based biofuels, the objective to have economic replacements for gasoline in our motor vehicles, even it would be subject to the same economic law of gravity, right? These are kind of basic economic laws. If I am able to create a truly equivalent fuel from ethanol, and if the oil price globally goes up, what's going to happen to the ethanol-based fuel? It too will go up on an equivalent basis, right? Even if those points were not the case, the United States has economic partners around the globe, including also military partners, and we have an interest in their economic health, right? So there's, to the idea, the objective of achieving energy independence is incredibly widespread in our politics, but I would assert that in reality it doesn't exist. So that's thought one. Thought two on Paris more directly. The climate change issue is an issue on which either the globe succeeds or the globe fails. Either we constrain the aggregate change in the global climate through a collection of measures undertaken in all of the countries that have meaningful emissions, and the United States most certainly has very, very large emissions, or we will all suffer the consequences. Now, the consequences of a changed climate will not be identical and everywhere. There are places where the climate will get more friendly to human inhabitation. Hot temperatures may be replaced by slightly different temperatures. But there are lots of places in the globe, if you look at some of the projections of regional impacts, where you either can expect, on average, warmer temperatures, changes in the hydrological cycle so that the seasonal rains don't come in the right seasons, the movement of pests and disease. So there are lots and lots of risks associated with that. Now, does not make me happy at all to say that it appears that the President of the United States does not believe in the science of climate change. To me, this is a stunning thing to say as an American, but there is no evidence that the US President understands and accepts, notwithstanding the remaining uncertainties around the functioning of the climate system, that nonetheless there is a very clear link between emissions of greenhouse gases from human activity and the changing of our climate. So I'm going to say something that's paradoxical. Please hear this correctly. The paradox is, if President Trump made his decision about Paris because he had some elegant plan, maybe crazy plan, about supporting US industry, that would be one thing. I don't think it's even that. I think it's an ignorance about the science, and I'm sorry to say that. Please.
Thank you. First of all, thank you for the presentation. It was very interesting. And I have a question. Do you see any scenario where Russia and USA can cooperate in energy sector with Trump or without?
Look, there's yes is my short answer. Yes, but it's not something that is going to be an outcome that one reaches quickly and easily. So Mr. Tillerson was our Secretary of State, was quoted around the time of his visit to Moscow a couple of months ago as saying that quite possibly US-Russian relations were at their worst point ever. He may be right about that, but I don't understand his comment as being a celebration. On the contrary, I understand it as being a diagnosis and something that he would like to see us move away from. He's absolutely right in that regard. Again, colleagues, I don't mean to be argumentative about this, but I'm telling you simply, again, as a diagnostic point, that the reports in the United States, whether they are right or they are wrong, about the role that Russia played in the US election are a profound problem. And it will take very hard work by people in our and your diplomatic services and elsewhere in our governments to move past that very big concern. I think it absolutely is possible for the United States and Russia on a wide variety of topics to have our relations improve, but it will take hard and serious work.
Over here.
Thank you so much for your lecture. I want to ask you about American business. What do you think? Is there any opportunity for American companies which involved in this renewable innovations to invest in foreign countries, or is it still more profitable to stay in America?
No, on the
Thank you.
contrary, I mean, this is the amazing thing. This is one of the many amazing things about the decision in regard to Paris, is that the transition to a low-carbon economy, which, as I said, is happening in the United States on the basis of real investments being made at scale all across our economy, that transition is happening globally as well. And US companies absolutely want to be in that global market helping that transition to happen. They want to do that not because they are being altruistic, they want to make money. It's pretty simple. And if you look at some of the different technologies, whether one is talking about wind turbines or storage batteries or other technology, there's a great opportunity to do that globally. I think you were next.
Okay. My name is Adeni from New Gas Technologies, and my question is slightly about the US and slightly not about the US. So in this conversation, I think one of the key pieces of the puzzle that we're leaving out, I think, is what is happening on the continent itself, in North America, especially, say, between Canada and the United States, the kind of energy special relationship between the two countries. So my question is about the opportunities or the options available to Canada in terms of having its own sort of very independent policy when it comes to climate change. So for example, when we talk about the pipelines, for example, that will be implemented. I mean, Canada has, I think, according to the NAFTA rule, this proportionality rule that makes it impossible or makes it difficult for Canada to export to other places except the United States. Like there is this proportionality rule that says that the United States gets a first come, first serve kind of thing under the NAFTA rule, I believe. Okay, I might be wrong. But anyways, the point being that if the pipeline goes online, most of that greenhouse gas emissions would go and be credited to Canada, effectively saying that, literally thinking that, Canada's oil is US oil in that sense, if you think about it, if the implementation or the development of those reserves would have to depend on not Canada's policies, but US policy. So the question is, what options are available to Canada in terms of ensuring its own, or achieving its own climate goals when it comes to what the US is doing?
So thank you for that question. I mean, the case of different approaches to the climate issue as between the United States and Canada, to me, are one of the most interesting comparative points to focus on. Canada's economy is a resource-dependent economy at present. It doesn't mean that Canada doesn't have other elements in its economic activity, but a great deal of it comes from natural resources, from oil, from gas, from minerals, from forestry products, etc. But the Trudeau administration has very, very clearly signaled the direction of travel. And that direction for Canada is toward a low-carbon, climate-protective economy. And so when we hear in the United States in the last couple of months expressions of Canada's policy choices and policy priorities, a number of us wonder what's the missing piece of DNA that the current US leadership doesn't understand, that we too could profit from the low carbon future that is out there. Now, in regard to NAFTA, the North American Free Trade Agreement, that free trade agreement requires, between Canada and the United States, equivalent treatment to companies from each other's markets. So a US company investing in or trading with Canada must receive the same terms that a Canadian company would. But there is nothing in NAFTA, nothing whatsoever, that determines where pipelines should go or where oil should flow or anything like that. Yeah, about export, there's a different issue, which is that currently Canada's pipelines flow from Canada to the United States. And frankly, the Canadians as I have told Canadian colleagues now for more than 10 years, would be well advised and well served to create export capacity to their own coasts so that they do not have such a high degree of reliance on demand coming from the United States. There's a rather famous case of the so-called Keystone XL pipeline that was proposed now, I don't know, 15 years ago, and that would have moved Canadian heavy oil from Alberta down into the United States and to the US coast of the Gulf of Mexico. And one of the decisions that was made by the administration that I worked for was not to approve that project, which to this day I think was a regrettable wrong choice. Because as an alternative, a lot of the oil that is produced in the mid-continent, both of Canada and the United States, moves not by pipeline, which is relatively reliable and safe and secure, but instead by train, which is neither, well, it's certainly flexible in terms of where one moves the oil, more flexible than a pipeline, but in terms of safety to the public and to the environment, it's much less preferable. So, in short, Canada would be well advised to, and naturally should want to have its production of oil, gas, or anything be available to the market. That's Canada first, right? Which I hope, I mean, there's lots of my country first impulses right now in the globe. I'm not recommending that, but that's a reasonable choice that Canadians can and should make. Excuse me, should make.
Yes, Vitaly Ermakov, High School of Economics. Jonathan, I have a question regarding oil price discovery as it happens today. Whether you think there are some distortions in the process, and I guess I need to explain the reason for that, or basically give a few examples. In the paper market, the indicators people are watching are really very focused on the developments in the US. For example, the number of drilling rigs added. Well, it's a big deal, and it's generally considered as an indicator of activity in the sector, future production. But in the US, we all know that a well drilled is not necessarily a well completed. So it's a little bit of a distortion right there. Second, people are looking at the Permian Basin in the US, and it generates tremendous quantity of news and excitement. And again, this is sort of, there's a lot of hyperactivity around this indicator, and yet it's around 3% of global oil production. So these indicators, they are very much the drivers of today's global price. And so the question is, how reliable is the process of global oil price discovery?
So look, honestly, I cannot claim to have studied this issue with great analytical depth, but I can tell you a couple of observations. First of all, your point about the high degree of reliance among oil traders on a weekly set of data that come out of the United States is clearly true. To me, the answer is not that something's wrong with those data, it's something that is wrong with the absence and the timeliness of other data. The Energy Information Administration, which was created in the wake of the 1970s oil crises, was created for the purpose of providing non-political analytical information on a regular and timely basis to inform our market. Everything I've said so far, I think, to me, is a good thing. The problem is that there is not sufficient other information that is trustworthy and available on a prompt basis in other places around the globe. In most cases, for example, under the system the so-called JODI system, the Joint Organizations Data Initiative, that is administered by the International Energy Forum and that gathers together information from 6 different global statistical sources. The availability of those data on an M-1 last month basis, not this week, but last month, is something that JODI is still working to achieve, and with great question about the ongoing accuracy of those data. So my first point is there is a great need to inform all of the market participants globally. There is a great need for more accurate, more timely, and more broadly available information. Why should a country go to the expense of doing that? Because that helps to inform the market and make sure that people are acting on the basis of the best information about the physical realities. Now, you're completely right that there is a great deal of attention that is paid to those weekly data that come out from EIA, the Energy Information Administration in the US. And there is also, as the nature of US demand changes, there is a reason to think that those data, that the interpretation of those data needs to be different slightly than what it was 10 years ago or 15. Because one of the numbers that is looked at very carefully each week is the level of stocks that are held by different companies around the United States. So I would be the last person to say that I think that the information base is perfect globally. I don't think that it is. But I also think that it requires some concerted hard work. And by the way, I called the attention of the group to efforts that are underway in this regard. The International Energy Agency in Paris spends a huge amount of its time doing training programs on energy statistics and data for people both from the members of the IEA and also from non-member countries. The International Energy Forum, as we were discussing earlier, holds an annual meeting that focuses on outlooks for the global energy markets. This outlooks meeting involves IEF countries, those who are in IEA and in OPEC, and those who are in neither IEA nor OPEC, such as the Russian Federation. The IEF meeting also involves IEA members and OPEC members. And the purpose is not to develop a singular projection of future markets, but rather for the deep professionals in that space to understand the sensitivity of that model to this factor, and why did the IEA come up with that figure as opposed to a different projection. So it's a meeting of the minds in that space. So again, look, there are the component elements of price formation in oil are hugely numerous. They're all subject to the ability to receive and trust, for the basis of economic decision making, to receive and trust data about what's happening in the market. Sorry, I missed who.
Компания ProMash Технология. Большое спасибо за презентацию. И у меня такой вопрос. Связано ли с энергетической политикой Соединенных Штатов сотрудничество Трампа с Саудовской Аравией, его оппозиционное отношение к Катару? И если да, то каковы мотивы? Если да, если это связано, то каковы мотивы?
Sorry, let me make sure that I understand the question correctly. The relationship, do I understand correctly, the relationship between Mr. Trump and Saudi Arabia and then the actions that have been taken in regard to Qatar? Did I understand correctly?
Да.
Okay. So, as you will know, as your question signals an understanding, there was a discussion, the visit by President Trump to the Kingdom of Saudi Arabia several weeks ago that included, as part of that visit, meetings that took place with the members of the Gulf Cooperation Council. And shortly thereafter came the decision by several members of that council, Saudi Arabia, Bahrain, and UAE, plus Egypt, to institute essentially an economic boycott of Qatar. Now, I honestly don't know whether the Saudis acted on the basis of some understanding, private understanding with the president. I would certainly hope that that is not the case. There's been a lot of speculation in the United States about whether there was some message that was received even if it was not given, or maybe the message was given as well. I'm sorry that all I can tell you is that there's lots of speculation, and as far as I can hear so far, no real information about this. It is certainly clear that the Secretary of State has been urging care and calm in the interaction between those countries and Qatar. I don't see care and calm being the predominant features just yet.
First of all, thank you for your presentation. And my question is following. During your presentation, you mentioned that there is a huge opposition to Mr. Trump's energy plan in Congress. And in order to overcome this opposition, Mr. Trump has to find supporters inside Congress or in the society. And my question is, are there really potential or actual powerful supporters either inside Congress or state electorate?
So thank you for your question, because it highlights that I need to make sure that I was clear in my statements. I do not wish to be understood as having said that there are no supporters in the Congress for the energy policy that President Trump has suggested. There are some supporters who are very, very strong in their support for President Trump's suggestions. In particular, there are many in the Republican Party who are very strongly attracted to the deregulatory emphasis. There are some very important members of Congress who are very opposed to certain elements of the president's proposals. So the reality is quite nuanced as to the particular piece of his energy policy program that is being suggested. And I suspect that the president will be able to secure support for many elements of his intended program from the Congress. Just to confuse matters more, that doesn't mean that the conversation is over, because in many cases, in a way that is almost stereotypical or a parody of ourselves, because we are Americans, this matter will also be fought out in the courts. And some of those battles will go on for years to come. For example, under the terms of our Clean Air Act, the Environmental Protection Agency in the United States was required to make a formalized determination as to whether there is a danger to the public interest that arises from the emissions of greenhouse gases. And that finding, the so-called endangerment finding, from the Environmental Protection Agency was, yes, there is a danger. If there is a danger, then the government, the federal government in the United States, is required under our Clean Air Act to respond to that risk to the environment and to public health. sooner or later there will be a further fight over this endangerment finding in our courts. That's one example, but it's only one. And for example, with the Clean Power Plan, as I said earlier, there is a requirement to, on the Trump administration to go through the procedures of trying to create a valid justification that not implementing the Clean Power Plan is better than to implement the Clean Power Plan. Those pieces of rationale also, I think, inevitably will be a matter of debate and contest in our courts. So, in short, and this kind of goes back to, I've forgotten who posed the very first question about, or early question about whether there is anything that President Trump can do in regard to our energy policy. The answer is clearly yes. But it remains to be seen just how much of his program will actually get supported by our Congress and will withstand challenge in our courts. That's a very open question. One postscript to that. I mean, one of the areas that the President of the United States has the greatest influence over, but again does not have single-handed influence over, is the budget that is put in place for the executive branch of the United States. Last month, President Trump put forward a proposal for the budget. The actual decision about that budget gets to be made by, in the form of a piece of legislation that comes from our Congress and that must be signed into law by the President. The budget that was proposed by President Trump would have dramatic impacts in the operation of many elements of the US government, including lots of actions that relate to the energy sector. Pollution today, innovation budgets for tomorrow, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. Even that, he will really have a big struggle to pass in the form that it was proposed, because I think that members of Congress will wish to see more generous budgets, more plentiful budgets for many of the things that he's looking to cut. So I'm sorry to give such a nuanced or gray answer. I hope it was clear, but I realize that our system, if one looks from the outside, might be a little confusing sometimes, so. Please.
Kapustin from the Energy Research Institute.
So, yes.
Thank you again for your research. And I would like to ask you a couple of questions, if I may. The first one being, about 2 or 3 years ago, there were many concerns about the environmental impact of unconventional resources, such as fracking, the burning water, and oil and gas. Now we don't hear that much about it. Have some real improvements, technological improvements, have taken place, or has it been just swept under the rug to not upset the energy companies? That is the first question. And the second one...
Hold the second question, because let me try to respond adequately to the first. So, yes, you're right that there has been, and there continues today, to be a great deal of focus on the environmental impact of unconventional development across the United States. Many of the decisions about whether to permit that development are made at the level of our states. Some of the states have been very supportive, others have been very reluctant, and some have actually instituted bans. And sometimes that discussion is informed by actual information and science from industry, and sometimes it's not, just to be candid. Now, there was a widespread view about, I would say 8-ish years ago, that the industry was being extremely resistant to acknowledging that there are risks associated with unconventional gas development or unconventional, the light tight oil development. I challenge anybody in this room to identify any energy technology where there are no risks of environmental impacts. But there's a different quality to some of the impacts that we're talking about here. I mentioned that, and I'm sorry, this will be old news to many of you, that one of the things that is a defining characteristic of the unconventional development is that you're drilling lots and lots and lots of different wells on a very frequent basis, and you need supplies of water and other so-called proppant, sand, other materials to be delivered to the well site in order to do the hydraulic fracturing. There are other sources of disturbance above the ground, noise, very, very powerful pumps that are pushing the fracking substances below ground at very high pressure. So there's a lot of risks to be managed. There's a lot of issues to be managed. The interesting thing is that the industry has been very effective at managing in most cases. I don't wish to be understood as saying that 100% of the environmental risks have been managed effectively, but the vast majority of them have been. Now, including that today's fracking jobs require much less water, much less sand or other substances to prop open the pores of the shale, et cetera. So fewer voyages by truck to and away from the site. Nonetheless, for example, the state that I live in, which is the state of Maryland, just outside of Washington, D.C., has a ban in place. So fracking is not allowed at all in the United States. Excuse me, in the state of Maryland. I don't think that decision was made on the basis of a detailed understanding of the state of the art, the state of the science. But that's the decision that was reached by state-level decision makers.
May I ask another question?
I don't object if others don't object, so.
As we all know, the unconventional, the shale fracking revolution has taken place during Mr. Obama's terms as president. Moreover, he has been quoted to say that he would like to see America energy independent, and moreover, for the United States to become an energy superpower. It was his own words. Thusly, I would like to ask you, do you think, is the Trump's energy policy that much different from Mr. Obama's? And is the friction, the political friction in the United States, including the energy questions, is more due to Trump's apparent not very high popularity among the Congress and...
Sorry, more due to what?
Due to his low popularity amongst the Congress and political parties.
So, the Obama administration gave priority to a very concretely technology-neutral approach to energy policy, and concurrently to an effort to reduce the greenhouse gas emissions and other environmental impacts from our energy sector, and to do so progressively over time. Mr. Trump, by contrast, if you look at the things that are the elements of his America First energy policy, is de-emphasizing environmental concerns and is giving greater emphasis to the domestic production of energy. It is the right of every incoming U.S. president to determine his or her program. It's the right of our political system to react to that. Mr. Trump has very, very strong supporters who are in his camp no matter what, at least so far. He has also today strong support from members of his party in the Congress. So we'll see how much things change over time. It's difficult for me to predict it. I think that it's clear that even just from the rhetoric that has been used, that the intention is to move in what I would think is going to be a significantly different direction, one that gives much greater emphasis to domestic fossil fuel production and much lesser emphasis to the clean energy transition that was a high priority for the previous administration.
Okay, now I think I'll use the privilege of moderator to ask the last question. So, Jonathan, you've mentioned with some cautiousness that Trump is looking probably not just on energy independency, but even energy dominance in the global arena. So, summing up, how would you make the conclusion for the rest of the world? What does Trump as the US president mean for the global energy system? Like the most important, the most sensitive consequences for the rest of the world and for Russia in particular?
Right. First of all, I mean, I wish it were true, but it is evidently so far not true that the new US president considers with any apparent care the way in which the words that he utters are heard in other places around the globe. Now, in fairness, he's not elected by people elsewhere around the globe. Forgive me, I'm stating things that are self-evident, but that's, you know, so his supporters would say he's doing what his supporters wish for him to do. That may be true, but I think it is also, in the end, not productive for my country to be careless with words like energy dominance. The United States isn't going to be energy dominant. Decisions about where investment happens, where exports go to, are going to be made by the marketplace. Now, that doesn't mean that the United States has no other issues or concerns that it may wish to prioritize within its policy, but energy dominance to me is the kind of carelessness that doesn't help anybody. So if I were at another country, what would I do? I'd be careful to differentiate between things that are expressed by the president or anybody else as an objective and things that are likely to happen. That difference is critical because the former may be a mirage and the latter may be reality. So, anyway.
Okay, thank you so much.